The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 20548 in the name of Maurice Golden on tackling climate change, the role of Scottish agriculture. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to take part in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, please? And I call on Maurice Golden to open the debate. Mr Golden, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank members of the SNP, the Labour Party, including a welcome addition, and the Liberal Democrats for supporting my motion today. This Parliament has set out ambitious targets of achieving net zero by 2045. If we are to meet that target, there can be no doubt that we must have the support of Scottish agriculture. Scottish farmers, crofters and other rural businesses are on the front line of the effects of climate change in Scotland, which is why we see the NFUS proactively engaging with food producers and supporting action to produce better environmental outcomes. They understand those outcomes underpin the long-term future of farming in Scotland. Our job as policymakers is to work with farmers and rural businesses to help make that change happen, to provide them with support, remove obstacles from their path and reduce the risks of transitioning to new ways of working. It is important to recognise, though, that agriculture already has one of the lowest emission levels of any sector, just 9% of total UK emissions, and UK beef production is more carbon efficient than the global average. In all, Scottish agricultural emissions are down almost 30% from the 1990 baseline. Unfortunately, that is often overlooked because agriculture and land management measures are accounted for separately. We must also recognise that some emissions are inherent in food production. Even so, farmers are working hard to improve environmental outcomes. They manage important woodlands and peatlands, both of which are important carbon sinks. They work with the likes of SEPA on agro-environmental projects to improve water and soil quality, bolster flood measures and protect our biodiversity. All too often, though, farmers and land managers don't get the recognition they deserve. Just last week, the director of the Soil Association Scotland wrote in the Scotsman newspaper to urge politicians to, and I quote, start valuing and rewarding farmers for the important services they provide. I could not agree more. What farmers really need, though, is action for the long-term sustainability of their business. That is how we ensure they continue to produce environmental outcomes we need. We must have a Good Food Nation bill to help provide the vision for the future agricultural policy. One obvious measure is to provide direct support for farmers to use more environmentally friendly practices. Upfront costs that do that can be prohibitive, though, and that's why I proposed an agricultural modernisation fund and work to have that included in the Climate Change Act. I'm pleased to have got cross-party support for that amendment. And that will ensure that proposals for a future fund are included in the next climate change plan. And funding for modernisation and upgrades is needed now more than ever. Productivity has dropped for 3 years in a row. Incomes are down by almost 10%, whilst farm debt is at its highest since 1972. And at the end of last year, dozens of farmers across Scotland were still waiting for cap payments from 2017. Rural Scotland needs reliable support to prosper and become more sustainable. And the Scottish Conservatives are willing to work with the Scottish Government if they're serious about putting that in place. For example, we can surely all agree on the benefits of giving farmers and rural communities more control over their recycling and waste management services. This could improve environmental outcomes, reduce farmers' costs and boost rural economies. The Scottish Conservatives propose doing this through a new Food Producers Fund to provide equipment and infrastructure to set up on-site anaerobic digestion, microplastic recycling centres and waste hubs. Farmers could benefit from on-site anaerobic digestion to generate energy and heat and in turn reduce costs. Microplastic recycling centres would provide more convenient access to recycling services for rural and island communities with shorter transport distances and better environmental outcomes. Collection services should be tailored to local conditions to simplify logistics and make dumping waste less attractive. Local economies would be boosted too through job creation and the creation of localised circular economies with low-value feedstock being transformed into higher-value products. Waste hubs would work in tandem with the micro-recycling centres to further simplify logistical and cost burdens by acting as a single access point for waste streams. They would also provide a much-needed alternative and capacity for farmers who can no longer burn plastic waste. We all have a job to do in educating the public about the vital role Scottish farmers play. That is why the Scottish Conservatives are proposing the creation of school farms, which would allow children from local schools to come together and learn about food production, healthy eating and rural life. I'll happy to take an intervention from
I was waiting for a appropriate
Liam
moment.
McCarthy.
Could I thank Maurice Golden very much for taking an intervention, congratulate him on securing the debate and apologise I won't be able to stay to the end due to the Justice Subcommittee meeting at the moment. But in terms of the range of measures he set out, I think that goes to the point that's been made by the NFU about the importance of having a suite of measures to reflect the different types of agriculture across the country. As well as ensuring that suite of measures is available, does he also agree that any future trade agreements need to ensure that food imports into the UK at least meet the same standards that we require of our own farmers in this country?
Maurice Golden.
Yes, I quite agree that the best quality food that is produced here in Scotland, and any standards for the whole of the UK should reflect that. I also note the member is hailing from Orkney, and that is a fantastic example of a place that deserves further support on this. There's an excellent report commissioned by, and I'll declare an interest by myself when I was at Zero Waste Scotland, on the benefits of the bioeconomy in Orkney and some really useful ways in which we can use the waste from and byproducts from the whisky sector, from the dairy production up in Orkney, and ensure that we're not transporting lots of waste across Scotland, the UK and wider. So I would urge all members to have a look at that. But of course this motion speaks of the need for joined up practical policies. That is what I've outlined here today. The measures that are clear in their intent work to support farmers, improve environmental outcomes, which can be delivered right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Gail Ross, to be followed by Finlay Carson. Ms Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank my colleague Maurice Golden for bringing this very important and timorous members' debate to the Chamber today. The motion is absolutely correct to welcome the contribution of Scottish agriculture to protecting the environment and being part of the solution to tackling climate change. We are at a critical time in fighting climate change, and the Independent UK Committee on Climate Change noted that Scottish policies that are adopted over the next 12 months are likely to determine the policy direction of the next 25 years. The policies that affect our agricultural sector will be particularly important for any mitigation or reduction in emissions to help us reach our very ambitious targets. In 2017-18, it was estimated that Scottish farmers lost around £161 million due to extreme weather, which resulted in lower crop yields and livestock losses. So the Scottish agricultural sector is on the front line of the impacts that climate change will and is already bringing. It is also true, however, to note that we can use our land to combat the effects of our current climate emergency. Improving sustainable farming methods will be integral to reaching our goal of net zero emissions, and the WWF highlighted a number of policies that we can adopt in order to reduce our emissions. Reducing nitrogen fertiliser use, improving animal health, promoting organic farming, and investing in agroforestry are all things that could reduce up to 38% of Scottish agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. But to achieve this, we must assess the way in which we advise, train and offer incentives to our farmers. We must set clear emission reduction targets. We must improve the quality of monitoring and reporting on our emission levels. And as Maurice Golden has already mentioned, the introduction of the Good Food Nation Bill can deliver the legislative impetus that we so desperately need. In the most recent meeting of the Cross-Party Group on Food, which I co-convene along with my colleague Mark Ruskell and Colin Smith, I stressed that we should not demonise our food industry in our quest to combat climate change, because farming is critical for our economy and supports thousands of jobs in our rural areas. So in order to seamlessly enact the policies needed to halt this emergency, we should look to educating the general public on how food is produced. And I was interested to hear Maurice Golden's suggestions on how some of that could happen. And at the Cross-Party Group, it was noted that conveying the nuanced messages concerning food production has been difficult, and there is a lot of misinformation in the public sphere, certainly with regard to the meat versus vegetarian or vegan diet that we're currently seeing at the moment. Increasing investment in home economics in schools was one of the suggested ways which we can realise this goal. So we can educate, we can create policy, but we also need to encourage action at grassroots level. And the Scottish Wildlife Trust have stated that farmers and crofters need greater recognition, reward and incentive for taking positive steps in mitigating emissions. The Scottish Government has taken steps towards this with the, as again Maurice Golden noted and is in the motion, the Agricultural Modernisation Fund, which was a great amendment to the bill. This fund will aid investments in agricultural mitigation measures. Another investment announced just yesterday is the continuation of the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, another £34 million, which will go towards promoting environmentally friendly land management practices. But one piece of feedback I did receive from a local crofter was the possibility of making the application process easier, and I wonder if the Minister can reference this in her closing remarks. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, we are in the midst of a climate emergency. Our agricultural sector will be critical in our fight against it. We must encourage meaningful policy to be developed and ensure we take swift steps to enact it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Finlay Carson, followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to highlight the role farmers are playing in tackling climate change. I'd also like to refer members to my registered interest as a member of the NFU and welcome a couple of farmers from Scotland's most beautiful constituency in Galloway and Western Fries to the Chamber. I'm proud to be the party's representative on the recently established Climate Change Working Group, and while agriculture is not its sole focus, one of my priorities is to highlight the role farming can play and that the contribution of and the efforts of the agricultural sector are fairly represented and accredited. Agriculture is responsible for emissions associated with food production, but farmers, whilst undertaking that food production, are also, more often than not, directly or indirectly responsible for sequestration through tree planting, soil management, peatland restoration and biodiversity protection, all viewed as very positive for the climate. Often the activities of farmers that given sequestration, carbon or production of renewable energy are recorded, as Maurice Golden said, in other sectors' inventory figures. I was delighted that Maurice brought forward the amendment to create an agricultural modernisation fund, which is now part of the Climate Change Act, ensuring that funding for modernisation and upgrade and support for farmers will be part of the imminent climate change plan. Because farmers must be given the support and tools to fully benefit from what they're already doing to achieve what are highly ambitious emission target reductions. I have been dismayed and angered over the last year or so at the agenda that I feel has been targeted against the agricultural industry and our livestock producers in particular. Unfortunately, aided and abetted by sections of the media, the positive message about our farming industry and how they are right now, today, tackling climate change has been drowned out by ill-informed activists who are too lazy and blinkered by their misplaced ideology to look at the rural and agricultural practices as a whole. How many of them have taken the time to do the research and find the agricultural industry has reduced emissions by an incredible 29% between 1990 and 2017? And don't even get me started on the blatant promotion of veganism and veganuary as in the mainstream media. Now, where is the balanced argument? Where is the media scrutiny of the impact of importing soya or other out-of-season vegetables? Do the protesters acknowledge that agriculture is responsible for only 9% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions? Certainly will.
Mark Ruskell.
You mentioned soya. Is soya used as a livestock feed in Scotland?
I think I'll develop the argument as I go on, but I think the idea that we're eating vegetables from imported all over the world certainly does have a negative impact on our carbon footprint. But where is the scrutiny of importing soya? But as I say, it's only 9% of the total greenhouse gases, and cattle and sheep are responsible for just 3%. Having said that, the industry accepts it needs to do better, and Scottish farmers are already undertaking a range of practical measures to reduce emissions. These include improving livestock health and efficiency, soil management and sequestration, more efficient use of fertiliser, slurry and manure. And we need policies as outlined by Maurice Golding, but we must also ensure that future policies must not have the unintended consequences of displacing production to other parts of the globe with a far greater impact on the environment. Unintended consequences of carbon leakage and exporting emissions and production should be strongly analysed and considered. We must show caution when it comes to promoting whole-scale changes in the way people eat. If we are to truly tackle emissions, we should be encouraging people towards locally produced quality food. And caution should be exercised when advising that type of behaviour change, particularly around diet. We should not advocate a route forward that would undermine Scottish agricultural industry. Requiring reduction in emissions from farming and then promoting reduced consumption of local produce is not something that should be countenanced. We are repeatedly told we're in a climate emergency and they need rapid responses. And the fact that the vast majority of meat eaters in this country are not going to stop eating beef, and given that Scotland is only 75% self-sufficient, maybe we should not ask people to eat less meat, but we need to ensure that the meat they eat is Scotch beef and lamb produced locally, particularly given that greenhouse gas intensity of UK-produced beef in terms of carbon dioxide production is less than half that of the global average. But the industry must do more. We recognise the number of Scottish farmers and crofters are carrying out carbon audits, and that significantly increased over the years. Over 1,000 farms have participated in the Beef Efficiency Scheme, with carbon audits carried out on every farm over the last year. Deputy Presiding Officer, today's debate is a reminder there's lots to celebrate in the farming industry and what they've done and are doing in relation to tackling climate change. There's no room for complacency, but the debate going forward must be balanced and healthy rather than overblown, ill-informed and demonising.
Thank you very much. And I call Claudia Beamish, followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thank you to Maurice Golden for bringing this very important and vital topic to debate today. We must all confront the climate and environment emergencies, and the agriculture sector has a strong role to play in this. Farmers, crofters and land managers are among the first to need to adapt to climate change and face the extreme weathers day in, day out. But they also form a huge part of the efforts to mitigate any further damage. And this responsibility can lie heavy, particularly when there is such a high proportion of private sector employment in rural areas, and often in small and medium-sized enterprises across South Scotland and across wider rural Scotland. This is why I added my amendment to today's motion. I'm pleased that Maurice Golden recognised its relevance, and specifying the need for a wider just transition for Scottish farmers, which has been supported by some members in the Chamber today and beyond. Can I also thank those organisations who have sent briefings for the debate, which are always invaluable and inform us all. The Scottish Government needs to review the policy and support framework for agriculture emissions reductions, and with haste. The Agriculture Bill and the update to the Climate Change Plan cannot be opportunities let slip. WWF's recent report, Delivering on Net Zero, which has been mentioned by other members for Scottish agriculture, shows that a sustainable net zero pathway is very possible. It highlights the important mitigation measures that can be made at a farm level with little or no land use change. And the greater changes that which deliver more significant carbon savings are still feasible. And many use established technologies such as organic production, agroforestry, conservation, agriculture, and soil assessments and management. And the research is developing all the time on sustainable food production, soil management, nature-based solutions, supporting our fragile ecosystems and wildlife species. And these, many of them, can also bring savings for farmers if done in the right way. I want to focus briefly on agroforestry and its multi-benefits by way of example. Just this January, the Woodland Trust and Organic Research Centre published their findings on native species and on particularly the willow tree and how it can optimise the production in lambs due to its high mineral and protein content. Last summer, I visited Whitmere Organics and the farm shop of Pete Ritchie and Heather Anderson, who have led the way on so much innovation over the years. And I saw the agroforestry plantings which have benefited animals through such browsing opportunities, while also giving shade in summer and shelter in winter. And there are also coppicing opportunities. In the right circumstances, agroforestry offers a chance to open up new markets, transform high-risk monoculture to a mixed system, and also to profit the farmer. And for the public good, innovation like these reward our biodiversity and minimise flood risk, and keep quality Scottish produce at the table, mitigating climate change through riparian planting and also by carbon sequestration. We take very seriously in Scottish Labour the need to step towards the range of changes, of which agroforestry is just one example. And the UK Committee on Climate Change says that the incentives for agricultural land use have not seen the fundamental change that they need for decades. And the update must be far more robust than the present climate change plan. But these systems and these system-level changes cannot be tack-ons. They must be at the core of the development of our new subsidy regimes, supporting farmers in the just transition. And the new Agriculture Transformation and Modernisation Fund, highlighted by Maurice Golden, which was his amendment, supported on a cross-party basis, will give significant support. Many farmers are already shifting towards net zero and should be recognised for the work they do, as both Maurice Golden and Finn Carson have highlighted, and if I may say so, also John Scott highlighted in our committee, where planting for public good, renewable energy, peatland restoration and much more need to be recognised. And we cannot only see the right schemes and financial supports, but we also need to see strategic approaches to giving farmers the right skills, the latest knowledge and the tools to share and transfer these ideas in a cooperative way. This is at the core of the success of an agricultural just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Emma Harper. Mr Ruskell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the debate today brought forward by Maurice Golden. It also feels like this could have been a John Scott debate as well. So, we miss John and wish him all the very best. And, it does feel like there's been a significant political shift in recent years, recognising agriculture is both part of the problem, but also holds a solution to achieving our net zero target in Scotland. And I think it's good to take time to recognise the many exciting and passionate farmers across Scotland who are paving the way for climate-friendly farming. I've had the pleasure to visit many of these businesses across Scotland, from Linbrett Croft in the Cairngorms to Mossgiel in Ayrshire, places where farmers are tapping into generations of knowledge and skill to develop resilient, diverse and low-carbon farming models. However, the motion and debate today does run the risk of looking at only one side of the industry. We need to be cautious of adopting a congratulatory tone while ignoring the urgent changes that still need to be made in mainstream agriculture. The figure quoted in the motion of a 29% reduction in agricultural emissions since 1990 paints a much rosier picture than the reality. Over the last decade, emissions reductions have stagnated, with only a 2% fall since 2008. Agriculture still accounts for over a quarter of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's clear that we'll not achieve our net zero target if we do not significantly speed up the rate of change. There's also still work to be done to ensure all stakeholders in agriculture are on board. Just a couple of weeks ago, the NFUS President, Andrew McCormick, told the union's annual conference, and I quote, that we're being told climate change is coming, but we can't reach out and feel or touch it, so there have to be questions. Is this real, or are we just being told that? He then went on to suggest that planting trees is accelerating global warming. So, as politicians, we need to ensure that we're both working with the industry, but also listening to the science. The Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy's comments last year that he'll take no lessons, he'll take no lessons from our own scientific advisors, the UK Committee on Climate Change, has set a very worrying precedent. It's time for us all to face up to the huge job ahead and show some leadership. If I can get time back, I would let Mr. Golden in.
That was asked so nicely. Of course you'll get your time
Thank
back.
you so much.
Finlay Carson.
I'd just like to clarify where the member's statement about agriculture's contribution to Scotland's greenhouse gases, whether he's falling into the trap that so many do and are not considering the whole agriculture industry as around, including their contribution to sequestration and the methods of farming, but also forestry and renewable energy, or are you falling into the trap with just quoting and often misrepresenting the contribution that greenhouse gases play from agriculture?
Before you answer, please don't use the term you of another member. I'm the only you sitting here. YOU, by the way. YOU. Mr. Ruskell.
Mr. Carson, presiding officer, raises a very important point that we've discussed in committee, but of course we still have to recognise that when it comes to forestry or renewable energy production, these emissions are counted elsewhere. The important thing moving forward is to ensure that we have a whole farm approach to reducing emissions, but that will still result in significant change that we need. Now, the UK Climate Change Committee's report on land use policies for Net Zero UK, published just last month, did recommend a package of measures to help us achieve net zero emissions from land use, including increasing UK-wide forestry cover to at least 17% through both afforestation and agroforestry mentioned by Claudia Beamish, but also, Mr. Carson won't like this, reducing meat and dairy consumption by at least 20%, along with similar reductions in food waste. So, you know, we've got to not be afraid of talking about changes in land use and diets. Denying these will only leave agriculture in a weaker position to respond and adapt. The 20% reduction in meat and dairy consumption recommended by the CCC is pretty modest compared with UK government nutritional guidance as to what we should actually be eating. And to be honest, it's already been reflected in increasing consumer demands for meat-free and plant-based options. The long-awaited delivery of land use partnerships will be vital to meeting our net zero goals, but they need to have ambition and they need to have regulatory teeth. Farmers need to play an active role in this, but we also need to accept that in some places this will result in land use change. So it's right to celebrate and champion the good examples of climate-friendly, low-carbon agriculture that already exist in Scotland, and I welcome this debate. But the reality is that much work still needs to be done to mainstream these models across industry. The decisions we make in the coming years over future agricultural policy and subsidies will be the linchpin in determining whether we successfully deliver on this or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruskell. I call Emma Harper to be followed by Brian Whittle. Ms. Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate Maurice Golden for bringing this debate to the Chamber this afternoon and for allowing us the opportunity to discuss the enormous contribution that our farmers, crofters and producers do make in Scotland. Farmers and producers are the custodians of our land. They produce the food for our nation and they actively play their part in reducing emissions. And from the outset, I want to note how important it is that we all, MSPs, the media and wider society, actually do need to ensure that our farmers are valued, supported and recognised. And we must ensure our farmers are not, and our producers, they're not vilified. Presiding Officer, over the past 3 decades, farmers have contributed to an almost 30% reduction in emissions in Scotland. Scottish farmers already work hard to preserve the landscape, improve biodiversity, plant new trees and hedges also, and manage woodland and restore peatland. There was a peatland restoration project on a farmer's land which I visited at the Moss of Cree near Newton Stewart, where Dr Emily Taylor from the Crichton Carbon Centre and I measured the peat depth at 6 metres, and that's really deep. Farmers also improve the water and soil quality and generate renewable energy. And with the advent of new technologies, support from the Scottish Government, third sector and educational institutions like the SRUC, this list is always growing. It is worth noting that agriculture contributes a fraction of UK greenhouse gas emissions. UK agriculture is responsible for only 9% of total greenhouse gas emissions, while cattle and sheep, the majority of livestock production across Dumfries and Galloway and indeed Scotland, is responsible for just 3% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And while only responsible for 3% of UK emissions, Scottish farmers and crofters play an important role in generating renewable energy. The largest proportion of operational community and locally owned capacity in Scotland is located on farms and estates. And farmers and crofters do play their part, and we need to promote this. Again, Scottish farmers are not the climate change villains, and we should not demonise them, as Gail Ross and Finlay Carson have mentioned. Around 73% of Scotland's land area is designated as agricultural. Scottish farmers play a role in preserving our rural landscapes and improving biodiversity. And in managing and planting woodland, I note that since 2014, 19,875 hectares of woodland has been created under the Scottish Rural Development Programme's Forestry Grant Scheme. That's around, and about 30% of that is in Dumfries and Galloway alone. And in mentioning planting of hedges, I'd be interested to hear from the Minister how hedges are considered as part of carbon sequestration. Because we always talk about forests and trees and woodland, but hedges and replanting is also part of that carbon sequestration also. The Agricultural Modernisation Fund, which was committed to in the Scottish Government's programme for government and reaffirmed through funding commitments in the Scottish Government's upcoming budget, will also allow Scottish farmers and crofters and land managers to make plans for investing in a low-emissions future, and will assist them in making a transition to a low-emissions future. So, last week I attended the National Farmers Union Conference in Glasgow, and I was really interested to hear about how climate change was presented as an opportunity and not a barrier. And I think we need to look at what particular comments might have been made or not made, because everything needs to be perceived within context. And many persons highlighted actions that they are already implementing to reduce emissions. And one presentation was by Nigel Miller along with Mike Robinson from Farming for 1.5 Degrees, and that's worth noting. Their talk was all about cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and that work is being carried out also with Andrew Barber from SRUC Barony campus in Dumfries and Galloway. They're doing a lot of work, and again, you know, I know we're short of time, so I'd like to put my thanks on record to our Scottish farmers, our crofters and producers who, as we have demonstrated, are actively playing their part in tackling climate change and reducing emissions. Thank you.
I think members would know I'm letting you over a little bit because you're very interested and you have a lot to say on the topic. Can we have some time? I call Brian Whittleby, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank my colleague Maurice Golden for bringing this debate to the Chamber, because I want to take part in this debate to speak against the growing narrative that seems to be out there in Scottish farming, especially meat and dairy production, and that somehow that is over-contributing to climate change. So I take part in this debate to support our farmers, who we charge with producing food of the highest quality, to the highest standards. We charge them with custodianship of the countryside, and we demand that they pay that living wage. Yet when it comes down to it, in the public procurement process, far too little of homegrown produce makes it onto those tables. It is completely misleading to suggest that Scottish farmers should be lumped in with farming practices in other parts of the world. Our livestock is predominantly grass-fed, not the same as in the Americas, where we force-feed their livestock, or similar practices in the Far East. If we want to take positive action on climate change, which I'm sure we all do, surely we need to stop the practice of importing food that is readily available in this country. Stop negating the need for our farmers to export. And it's a fact that within the Central Procurement Excel contract, less than 20% of that contract is locally produced. Yet, we see somewhere like in East Ayrshire, with East Ayrshire Council, they've managed to procure local food in excess of 70%, so it can be done. And the next thing we need to do, we need to develop the food processing capability of Scotland. It seems ridiculous to me that we produce this high-quality food and then send it away to get produced. We have this situation with shellfish caught off the west of Scotland, sent to the Far East to get packaged and brought back again. That is, as far as carbon footprint goes, that is a ridiculous thing to be happening. And one of the main issues, I think, that is being lost in this deluge of misinformation from an overexposed section of society is health. Now, I'm very supportive that everybody should have the choice in lifestyle. People should have the opportunity to choose a healthy vegetarian diet or a healthy vegan diet or way of life. But certain elements should not be allowed to decry our farmers and the food that they produce. Of course I will, yeah.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank Mr Whittle for giving way? Can I ask him if he agrees with UK nutritional advice, as a former athlete himself, which recommends that we eat a little bit less meat and dairy products?
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank Mark Ruskell for that intervention, because he actually makes a very good point here. I think that what I would advocate is that we have a balanced diet. And he's absolutely correct to say that there are elements of society that eat far too much red meat within their diet, and that is absolutely correct. So I think in those respects, you are right. But if you look in context of what we're talking about here in terms of a balanced diet, the flip side of that is we have a section of society saying that we should not be eating any meat at all, and that is completely wrong. I think what I am supportive of, as I said, is the choice in lifestyle. My concern is that it's actually very difficult to maintain a good, healthy, balanced vegan diet, or even sometimes a vegetarian diet, in children. Animal protein is a very good source of many essential elements of a healthy diet that is difficult to replicate for children, and what children should be eating. And what we should point out here is that I think in terms of those kind of diets, is the choice of those diets is not often with the child, it's with the parent. And if a balanced diet is not maintained in early years, that is going to have an impact on later life. And I heard a ridiculous story that, from one of my constituents at one of the local nurseries, that they're refusing to give free milk to the children because, according to the person that runs the nursery, farming is destroying the planet. We have to get away from that kind of narrative. So I would like to point out finally that if we are serious about tackling climate change, as we should be, we need to continue to support our farmers as they make the environmental changes that we would like them to make. Be cognizant of foodstuffs imported as a so-called replacement for local produce, and recognise there's a carbon footprint in that production and that transport. We need to stop vilifying our farmers, Deputy Presiding Officer. We need to support them in public food procurement and in their actions in tackling climate change, stopping the need for us to import so much of our food. Our farmers have the capacity to feed our country healthy. It's time we help them. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm off to have a good old Scottish beef burger for my lunch. Thank you.
Colin Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Maurice Golden for his motion and securing today's debate, which does give us the opportunity to recognise that if we are to meet net zero, agriculture is part of the solution. And the sector gets that. There is a growing consensus on the necessary direction of travel. And as the motion rightly notes, farmers and crofters have already delivered a 29.4% drop in emissions since 1990. And that excludes, as Maurice Golden highlighted, a portion of the carbon reductions farmers and crofters have made because of the way those figures are calculated. But the climate crisis we face is stark, and it is now. Gail Ross rightly described this as a critical time. We need to build on the progress made to deliver greater reductions in emissions in the sector and develop that greener, more sustainable and more productive agricultural system we all want to see. And that will require political leadership and direction. I've got a lot of faith in the agriculture sector in Scotland and its ability to adapt, to change, to meet challenges. But the government needs to provide direction and detail. We know our current agricultural support system doesn't do enough to facilitate change, and in fact, at times, it is a barrier to that change. As we exit the Common Agricultural Policy, we need to develop a new support system which will deliver our environmental, economic and social aims. A system which supports and incentivises sustainability and environmentally friendly practices while building a more productive and resilient industry. These two aims should not be thought of as competing, and neither is achieved at the expense of the other. The most effective way to continue to reduce emissions is to support a strong, sustainable Scottish agricultural sector that balances climate change commitments with the need for food security. If we don't deliver that sustainability, it will mean an increase in imports, and that means an increase in emissions. And any change must be underpinned by the principle set out by my colleague Claudia Beamish in her addition to Maurice Golden's motion, a just transition for Scottish farmers, crofters and farm workers. Stakeholders across the board have been working hard on proposals for a system that reflects these priorities. Proposals by the industry such as NFUS's Step to Change and Route 2050 by Scottish Land and Estate recognise the need for meaningful reform to promote sustainability and better support the sector as it works to reduce emissions. And environmental organisations have been doing fantastic work on this area. In particular, WWF's report, Delivering on Net Zero, mentioned by my colleague Claudia Beamish, includes a number of detailed evidence-based proposals on how to reduce emissions, with their analysis suggesting that these measures could lead to a 38% reduction in agricultural greenhouse emissions by 2045. What we need, however, is leadership and direction and detail from the Scottish Government going forward, showing exactly what they intend to do in the months and years ahead. The creation of the Agricultural Transformation Fund is a welcome first step, and I commend the cross-party work to get this fund included in the recent Climate Change Act. But this does not compensate for an overall funding system which is no longer fit for purpose and has to change. The Government have set out a post-EU transition period until 2024. The agricultural bill currently making its way through Parliament is an opportunity to make clear, however, that it will not simply be business as usual during that transition period. The clock is ticking. In fact, time is running out when it comes to climate change. So I hope that bill will be strengthened by the Government, including having a purpose clause that puts the environment at the heart of the improvements the bill will hopefully lead to, including the proposed pilot schemes. And the Government will use the parliamentary debates on that bill to set out a clear timetable when they will outline a long-term agricultural policy for Scotland. Presiding Officer, we need to use what short time we have to trial new schemes to set out the changes we need in the future and support the sector to make those changes in a just transition to ensure that no one is left behind. By doing so, we can build on the progress that is already being delivered by Scottish agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Marie Goujon close for the Scottish Government. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I really just want to add my sincere thanks to Maurice Golden for bringing this debate to the Chamber and for the chance that gives me in closing to set out all that the Scottish Government is doing to support farmers, crofters and land managers to farm sustainably and to contribute to our climate change ambitions. And there has been so much raised in the Chamber today, so I sincerely apologise if I miss anything out or you feel like there's a point I haven't addressed. But follow up with me and I'm happy to meet with anybody to discuss what we're doing and the plans that we have for the future. Now, I couldn't agree more with what Maurice Golden had stated, that our farmers and crofters don't get the recognition they deserve. And he raised a lot of important points that I think it's worth re-emphasising and that we've heard echoed around the Chamber today. Because it is important to remember that our agricultural sector has reduced its emissions by nearly 30% on the 1990 baseline. And as I said, there have been so many important points raised today. And I'm also really glad that Finlay Carson highlighted the media's portrayal of our industry in Scotland and how that's been conflated with production systems in other parts of the world. And Brian Whittle really emphasised that this afternoon as well, because that's been a massive bugbear for me and for the Scottish Government in general, I would say, because it's just not a fair representation of how we farm here in Scotland. And it unfairly and unjustly points the finger at agriculture as if it's solely to blame. And that's where Emma Harper also raised an important point. We all have a role to play here in talking up the role that our farmers and crofters play and not vilify them. Yes.
Brian Whittle.
I thank the Minister for taking the intervention. In answer to the intervention I took from the Green Party there, what I should have said was, rather than suggest that we're eating far too much meat, shouldn't be promoting and saying that we need to eat more fruit and vegetables, because that again speaks to our farming community and we contribute much better to a balanced diet.
Minister.
And I think that's exactly what we would want to promote here. We want to promote a healthy, balanced diet, and that's essentially what it's all about. Now, in every part of Scotland, there are farm businesses making changes to their approach, which is cutting emissions. Now, over 3,000 have already undertaken carbon audits, and over 1,400 farmers are participating in the beef efficiency scheme. And through Pillar 1 greening, worth just over £130 million in the coming year, around 18,000 businesses are undertaking practices which protect our permeate grassland and the historic carbon sink under it, as well as promoting biodiversity. There are farms shifting to hardier breeds which require less intensive husbandry and can spend more time outside, and changing how they feed and what they feed their cattle. There are farmers already using precision farming methods to reduce fertiliser and pesticide use and improve productivity. Yes.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Minister, for taking an intervention. Would she agree that the Galloway beef breed is one of those ones that manages to stay out all year round, that can help contribute to a more efficient system?
Minister.
Absolutely, and I would add it was also one of my favourite breeds. You can't beat a Belty, well, unless it's an Aberdeen Angus, of course, representing my own area. But, Presiding Officer, our farmers and crofters are already playing their part in how Scotland contributes to addressing the global climate emergency, and that has to continue. And there are other initiatives which I hope will allow us to better recognise that. One that received press coverage recently was Carbon Positive, where we've been working with and supporting SAOS as they've been developing a tool which will help farmers better recognise all the work that they do on farm in relation to carbon sequestration. So one thing that I've always been clear on is that we cannot and must not look to address climate change through a single lens, and that's especially relevant when it comes to agriculture. Our farmers and crofters are being asked to deliver on multiple priorities such as biodiversity, air quality and water quality, as well as climate change. And we have to look to secure solutions that provide multiple benefits that will allow Scotland to address these areas whilst continuing to be a world-class producer of high-quality food. And I'm not saying that's going to be easy, because there isn't going to be one easy solution to this. But to achieve a sustainable future, we have to take a holistic and integrated approach where all of these issues are taken into consideration. And while many farmers and crofters are already playing their part, we need everyone to do more, because if Scotland is going to achieve net zero emissions by 2045, the country and everyone in it will be presented with challenges and opportunities, and our farmers and crofters are no different in that. Now, the Scottish Government already has in place a number of mechanisms to help farmers and crofters do more to reduce emissions and farm sustainably. And there's a lot of work underway in terms of future policy, which I think will address some of the points that have been raised today by both Claudia Beamish and Colin Smith. Because I think the strategic approach that Claudia talked about is exactly what we need to do. And I think there are other elements to that, such as land use strategies, and a lot of other points that have been raised around the Chamber today need to feed into that. Now, through our Farm Advisory Service, we offer a range of advice, information and technical guidance in areas like nutrient planning and management, livestock health and welfare, crop health, soil management and the benefits of woodlands on farms. And the Advisory Service also offers our farmers and crofters access to free carbon audits and discounted integrated land management plans with access to specialised one-on-one advice. Our Farming for a Better Climate initiative has a wealth of examples from our focus farmers who've looked at their business and identified areas in which they can not only embrace low-carbon farming practices, but improve their business as a whole. Yes?
Thank you for taking intervention. I heard on the radio today that Edinburgh University had discovered a letter, I believe from George Washington, congratulating and celebrating how skilled the Scottish farming sector was many, many years ago. Would the Minister agree that we've also got potential with the innovative and entrepreneurial farming sector that we've got, that the knowledge that they gain in addressing climate change can then be exported to the benefit of the whole world?
Minister.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've also got to make sure that a lot of this innovation that we see right now is actually spread right across the sector in Scotland. And I think that's something that we need to do. But absolutely, and I'm going to come on to talk about some of those examples as well. Because we've also we talked about agroforestry and woodland creation. And this past year saw Scotland exceed our woodland creation target. And building on that base, the Scottish Government has also established a soil regenerative agriculture Agriculture Network supported the highly regarded Monitor Farm Network. So I'll be visiting one of these monitor farms on Thursday, and this is where I want to bring in the point that Mark Ruskell had mentioned about visiting some of our climate change champions and some of the people he's spoken to, because I visited them all. So whether that's Lynn and Sandra at Lynbret Croft and some of the work that they've been doing on their farm, it's just incredible to see. There's Bryce Cunningham at Moss Giel, the work he's done on eliminating single-use plastics in his farm. And there's also the Budge sisters in Shetland. And while I was also in Shetland, I took the opportunity to visit a Uredale farm, and that was a chance to meet their native breeds and then enjoy those native breeds in the local restaurants later on. Because again, that comes back to another point that I think Finlay Carson had made. This is about local and it's about seasonal and not exporting problems elsewhere. And Brian Whittle again talked about another important point about procurement, and I think he spoke about East Ayrshire Council in particular. Now, they've been brilliant in relation to the Food for Life scheme, and it's been incredible to see the impact that that scheme has had on the local economy, on our children and on their health, and the fact that they've been able to do that within the budgets that they have. And these are examples that I would like to see replicated right across Scotland, because they've shown it's possible and that we can absolutely do that. Now, as a government, we are clear that we are here to encourage and support our farmers and crofters as Scotland makes this transition. This month alone, we've announced £40 million of new funding for the Agricultural Transformation Programme, which we've heard other members talk about today. We've increased funding for woodland grants, nearly £57 million, in order to meet our increased woodland creation target for 2020 to 2021 of 12,000 hectares. And we've also announced a new suckler beef climate group to examine how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within Scotland's suckler herd. Now, another point that was raised today, I think by Gail Ross, and Claudia Beamish mentioned it as well, was about organic farming. And that is also a vital part of this conversation, because we've seen the amount of land farmed organically decline. And that's where I am absolutely committed, and we as a government are committed to tackling that. And that's why we're currently working on an organic sector plan. And we're trying to play an active role in that, because that is something that we have to drive forward. Now, in the first half of this year, the Scottish Government's Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group is expected to report, and this group was established after a parliamentary debate in January 2019 and will make recommendations to ministers. And I know Gail Ross also talked about, I think, simplification of some funds, and I think that's part of the work that is being considered as part of this group. Now, the Scottish Government will then use this report and the findings of other sector-specific working groups as the basis for support policy design with the intention of implementation post-2024. Now, again, there's probably so much I didn't even get a chance to talk on today, but in drawing to a close, I hope I've been able to demonstrate the sheer volume of work which is currently underway, outlining exactly how we hope to deal with the challenges we face, as well as better recognising the work already being done by our farmers and crofters. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting till 2:30.